And here we have our lecture about the Great Depression. If I look at this title slide, first you see on the left the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest, when completed in 1941, was the largest man-made structure in world history. It eventually produced more than 40% of America's hydroelectric power, creating cheap electricity for rapid economic and industrial growth in that region in the 1940s and beyond. The dam was part of a public works revolution that transformed the American economy and landscape in the 1930s. The administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt spent far more money on building roads, dams, airports, bridges, and housing as part of the New Deal than on any other activity. The Columbia River Project was part of broad changes in American life and thought during the New Deal in the 1930s. The Democratic Party was transformed into a coalition of farmers, industrial workers, a reform-friendly urban middle class, liberal intellectuals, Northern African Americans, and the white supremacist South, all united by the belief that the federal government should protect Americans from the disruptions of modern capitalism. Liberalism, traditionally understood as limited government and laissez-faire economics, took on its modern meaning, an active national government that helped the less fortunate in society. The Great Depression and the New Deal also changed the meaning of freedom. Economic security became the essential element of how Americans thought of freedom. New Deal measures such as the Social Security Act, which assisted the unemployed and the elderly, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established a minimum wage, guaranteed Americans the social conditions necessary for freedom. But the New Deal also exposed and in some ways reinforced the boundaries of freedom. Its programs benefited industrial workers, but not tenant farmers, benefited men far more than women, and whites far more than blacks, who in the South were still denied basic rights of citizenship. And in the conglomeration of pictures on the right, you see FDR signing a bunch of an example of a New Deal legislation into law. There's a very famous photograph of FDR, which was promoted very heavily across the country. And there's a mural painted for WPA, Works Project Administration, celebrating all these national projects. These are ways in which the Roosevelt administration tried to show that the New Deal was a way to try to get out of the Great Depression. And now, the rest of the lecture is going to be narrated to you by Dana Flowers.
On October 29, 1929, a day that soon became known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. A panic ensued, and in 5 hours, $10 billion in market value disappeared. The United States quickly found itself in what became known as the Great Depression, which was the greatest economic calamity in modern history. Signals of impending disaster were visible before October 1929. Southern California and Florida had experienced spectacular real estate booms and busts, which resulted in failed banks and foreclosed mortgages. The highly unequal distribution of income and persistent depression in farming areas reduced Americans' purchasing power. Sales of new autos and household consumer goods stagnated after 1926. And European demand for American goods also declined. A bursting of the stock market bubble that had been created in the 1920s by speculators was inevitable. But when it happened, it was so severe that it destroyed many investment companies, wiping out thousands of investors and squelching consumer confidence. Around 26,000 businesses failed in 1930, and those that survived cut back on employment and investment. The financial system, which was based on the gold standard, could not effectively meet the downturn. Germany defaulted on its reparations payments to France and Britain, which in turn stopped repaying debts to the United States. Banks failed throughout the world as depositors withdrew money and millions of families lost their life savings. Stocks briefly rebounded, but soon resumed their precipitous decline. In 1932, the economy hit rock bottom, with GNP down by a third, prices down by 40%, and more than 11 million workers, 25% of the labor force, unemployed. Those who had jobs faced reduced wages and hours. Every industrial economy suffered, but the United States was hit hardest. The Depression quickly transformed Americans' lives as hundreds of thousands took to the road to look for work, stood in breadlines, and erected shack cities called Hoovervilles, and cities exhausted their relief funds for the poor. The Depression actually reversed the long-standing migration of Americans from farms to cities, as people tried to find land to grow food for their families. The suicide rate rose to its highest level in American history, and the birth rate dropped to its lowest. Also damaged was the public image of big business and Wall Street, which were shown to have thrived on shady dealings, such as the sale of worthless bonds. 3 months before the stock market crash, the magazine of Wall Street was avidly encouraging readers to purchase stocks. This lithograph, October 29, Dies Irae, a 1929 lithograph by James N. Rosenberg, depicts skyscrapers tottering, stockbrokers jumping from windows, and crowds panicking as the stock market crashes. The title means Day of Wrath. Unemployed men lined up outside a Chicago soup kitchen in 1931. Charitable institutions like this one were overwhelmed by the advent of the Great Depression. This graph illustrates the rapid rise and dramatic collapse of stock prices and the number of shares traded during the 1920s and early 1930s. This map shows the results of the 1932 landslide won by Franklin Roosevelt. This is a photograph of the giant Bonneville Dam on the Columbia River in Oregon as it neared completion in 1936. This was one of numerous New Deal projects that expanded the nation's infrastructure and provided employment to victims of the Depression. This image shows Presidents Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt on their way to the latter's inauguration on March 4, 1933. The two men strongly disliked one another. They barely spoke during the ride and never saw each other again after that day. This image shows a run on a bank. Crowds of people wait outside a New York City bank, hoping to withdraw their money. This is one of a series of murals painted in 1930 and 1931 by Thomas Hart Benton under the overall title, America Today, Changing West. It depicts some of the transformations occurring in that region, including oil exploration, factory development, and air travel. This is a photograph of police battling bonus marchers in Washington, D.C. in July of 1932. Soon afterward, President Hoover sent federal troops to evict the marchers. Many Americans responded to the Great Depression with resignation or blamed themselves for their economic woes. Others responded with protests that were, at first, spontaneous and lacking in coordination because the unions, socialist groups, and others that might have led them had been devastated in the 1920s. In early 1932, 20,000 unemployed World War I veterans who marched on Washington to demand the early payment of a bonus due in 1945 were dispersed by federal troops. Throughout America, demonstrations by the unemployed demanded work and relief. Farmers protested low prices by temporarily blocking roads to prevent goods from getting to market. The small Communist Party was the only group that seemed able to channel and direct the discontent. Communists formed unemployed councils that organized marches, demonstrated for public assistance, and opposed evictions of unemployed families. The newspapers discussed the idea that America was close to revolution. To many Americans, President Hoover's response to the Depression seemed inadequate and lacking in compassion. His advisors told him that depressions were a normal function of capitalism, that removed uncompetitive firms and encouraged moral virtue among the unfortunate. Businessmen vehemently opposed federal assistance to the jobless, and many suggested that individuals would survive the Depression through thrift. Federal policymakers who had never faced an economic crisis of this magnitude did not realize the extent to which consumer spending supported much of the economy. Most of them did not believe that federal assistance to the unemployed would spur economic recovery. Hoover maintained his commitment to associational action, strongly opposed direct federal economic intervention, and believed that private charity and voluntary action by business to keep up investment and employment would suffice. He called together business and labor leaders and established commissions to encourage firms to coordinate maintaining prices and wages without government regulation. Hoover's public reassurances that the economy was recovering clashed with reality and made him seem ignorant of the problems facing many ordinary Americans. This image shows a Hooverville, a shantytown created by homeless squatters outside Seattle, Washington in 1933. The Communist Party headquarters in New York City in 1932. The banners illustrate the variety of activities the party organized in the early 1930s. Some of Hoover's actions, such as the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raised already high taxes on imported goods, caused other nations to retaliate and decreased international trade, exacerbated the crisis. A tax increase that Hoover won from Congress in order to balance the budget further reduced consumers' purchasing power. By 1932, even Hoover conceded that voluntary measures were insufficient. He signed laws creating the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which loaned money to failing banks, railroads, and other businesses, and the Federal Home Loan Bank System, which gave aid to homeowners threatened with foreclosure. Although he had vetoed bills to create employment with public works projects like road and bridge construction, he now approved $2 billion for such projects and for local relief. But Hoover refused to do anything further, including providing direct aid to the unemployed, which he told Congress would be a disservice to the jobless. In the mid-1920s, some intellectuals had worried that the prevailing notion of freedom in America celebrated unbound economic enterprise, yet accepted limits on free speech and expression and other civil liberties. Though the prosperity of the 1920s reinforced this laissez-faire conception of freedom, the Great Depression and Hoover's failed response discredited it. By 1932, the basis for a new conception of freedom based on progressive-style positive state action in the economy and a respect for civil liberties and cultural pluralism was already present and would become the foundation of modern 20th century liberalism. This image shows cameramen at the White House during the presidency of Herbert Hoover. Hoover never became comfortable dealing with the mass media. This is an unemployed woman and man selling apples on a city street during the Great Depression. This shows a campaign poster from 1936 for the American Labor Party, a left-wing party created by labor unions in New York State that supported Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal. The placards illustrate some of the labor union's demands at the height of the union upsurge of the mid-1930s. Paradoxically, Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, who was raised in privilege on a New York country estate, came to symbolically represent the ordinary American citizen. Like Lincoln, FDR's greatness was his capacity to reject traditional ideas while confronting national crisis. FDR, as he liked to be called, was born in 1882, a fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He graduated from Harvard and served in the New York State Legislature and as Undersecretary of the Navy in World War I. After he ran for vice president on the Democratic ticket in 1920, he contracted polio and lost the use of his legs, a fact concealed from the public in the pre-television era. Very few Americans realized that this powerful president was confined to a wheelchair. In his speech accepting the Democratic nomination for president in 1932, Roosevelt promised a New Deal for the American people, but his campaign offered few specific proposals, Roosevelt discussed government's responsibility to ensure that every man had a right to make a comfortable living. But he also wanted a balanced federal budget and criticized Hoover for excessive federal spending. The biggest difference between Hoover and FDR's campaigns was the Democrats' call to repeal prohibition. Americans desperately wanted new leadership. Roosevelt won an overwhelming 57% of the popular vote, and Democrats gained a majority in both houses of Congress. The Depression provoked different responses across the globe. For most of the 1930s, conservative governments ruled in Britain and France, and they did little to resolve the crisis. In Germany, Adolf Hitler of the Nazi Party established one of the most brutal dictatorships in human history, banning all political opposition and terrorizing the Jews. In the Soviet Union, the tyrannical Joseph Stalin launched 5-year plans that industrialized the nation and allegedly eliminated unemployment, but at great social cost. Japan's militarist government invaded China in 1937 and aspired to dominate all Asia. Roosevelt envisioned the New Deal as an alternative to socialism, fascism, and unregulated capitalism. He wanted to reconcile democracy, individual liberty, and economic planning. But he did not begin his first term as president with a full-fledged plan. He initially depended on a group of intellectuals and social workers who took key positions in his administration. They included Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, a veteran of Hull House and the New York Consumers League; Harry Hopkins, who directed emergency relief during Roosevelt's term as New York's governor; Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, a veteran of Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Campaign of 1912; and Louis Brandeis, who had advised Woodrow Wilson in 1912 and now advised FDR while serving on the Supreme Court. Although these individuals represented the influence of progressivism on Roosevelt and the New Deal, they had no unified position. Brandeis, for one, thought large corporations not only were too powerful, but also had contributed to the Depression by keeping prices artificially high and limiting workers' purchasing power. He argued they should be broken up, not regulated. Yet the Brains Trust, a group of academics that included a number of Columbia University professors, thought bigness was inevitable in a modern economy. They believed the competitive marketplace had disappeared and that large firms should be managed and directed by the government, not broken up. Their view decisively shaped what came to be known as the First New Deal. FDR realized that Americans needed leadership and action immediately, and when he took office on March 4, 1933, he acted quickly. He started a campaign of reassuring Americans and restoring their confidence. At his inauguration, he declared that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. His first step was to confront a banking system about to collapse. Banks that had invested funds in the stock market were failing, and by March 1933, banking was suspended in most states. Roosevelt declared a bank holiday, temporarily halting all bank operations, and called a special session of Congress, which, on March 9th, passed the Emergency Banking Act to provide funds to endangered banks. Additional measures transformed the American financial system. The Glass-Steagall Act barred commercial banks from buying and selling stocks, and until its repeal in the 1990s, it helped prevent many of the irresponsible practices that had led to the stock market crash. The same law established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which insured the accounts of individual depositors. Roosevelt also took the United States off the gold standard, thus breaking the link between the nation's currency and the gold reserves, and making it possible to issue more money and stimulate more business activity. These efforts together saved the financial system and greatly increased the government's power over it. While 5,000 banks had failed between 1929 and 1933, a full third of all the banks in the United States, not one bank failed in 1936. This is a poster by the artist Vera Bach for the Federal Art Project of the Works Progress Administration. This is a 1949 map of the Columbia River Project, showing its numerous dams, including the Grand Coulee, the largest man-made structure in the world at the time of its opening in 1941. The Banking Acts were the first of a series of laws passed in the first 3 months of FDR's administration, a period known as the 100 Days. Roosevelt used the crisis and his electoral mandate to pressure Congress into passing laws to stimulate the economy. Congress established a plethora of alphabet agencies, such as the National Recovery Administration, NRA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, and Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, to direct the recovery. Never had an American president exercised so much power or so quickly expanded the role of the federal government in Americans' lives. The key to Roosevelt's plan for recovery was the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, largely based on the government-business partnership created by the War Industries Board in World War I. The law established a National Recovery Administration, NRA, to set industry codes with groups of business leaders that would serve as guidelines for output, prices, and working conditions. This, it was hoped, would end the cutthroat competition that drove companies out of business, in part by exempting these industry-wide agreements from antitrust laws. FDR thus effectively repudiated an older idea of liberty based on the belief that the best way to encourage economic activity and ensure a fair distribution of wealth was to allow market competition to unfold free from government interference. To win support from labor, Section 7A of the NIRA recognized workers' rights to organize unions, which was a sharp departure from the open shop policies of the 1920s, and a move toward industrial freedom. The NRA soon adopted codes that set standards for production, prices, and wages in the textile, steel, mining, and auto industries. The agency launched a publicity campaign to promote itself, and its symbol, the Blue Eagle, was displayed in stores and factories affected by the codes. But the NRA became controversial when it was shown to have allowed large companies to dominate the code-writing process. Large corporations and companies raised prices, limited production, laid off workers, and divided markets among themselves at the expense of smaller competitors. Many anti-union companies ignored Section 7A. The agency lacked the personnel to enforce the 750 codes throughout the nation by 1935. The NRA did not create recovery or cooperation between capital and labor. The 100 Days also saw the issuance of government relief to the needy. Roosevelt and most of his advisors believed direct government payments to the unemployed would erode individual self-reliance, and the Economy Act reduced federal spending in the hopes of winning business support. But with nearly 25% unemployment, spending funds on relief was inevitable. In May 1933, Congress established the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to make grants to local relief agencies. But FDR preferred to create temporary jobs that would decrease unemployment while improving the nation's infrastructure of roads, bridges, public buildings, and parks. In March 1933, Congress established the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, which set unemployed young men to work on projects such as forest preservation and the improvement of national parks and wildlife preserves. By its end in 1942, the CCC had employed more than 3 million people. This is The Spirit of the New Deal, a 1933 cartoon in the Washington Star, and it depicts the federal government, through the National Recovery Administration, promoting peace between workers and employees. This image shows a Civilian Conservation Corps workforce in Yosemite National Park in 1935. The National Industrial Recovery Act also created the Public Works Administration, PWA, with an appropriation of $3.3 billion. Directed by Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, the PWA built roads, schools, hospitals, and other public facilities. In November 1933, the Civil Works Administration, CWA, was launched. And within a few months, it employed more than 4 million people in constructing highways, tunnels, courthouses, and airports. But costs soon skyrocketed, and criticisms mounted that the New Deal was creating a class of Americans permanently dependent on government jobs. In response, FDR dismantled the CWA. Other public works projects involved government-planned economic transformation, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, which built dams to prevent floods along the Tennessee River Valley and provide cheap electricity in a region with many isolated and rustic households. The TVA was the first time the federal government produced electricity in competition with private companies, and it served as a model for regional planning that would economically develop the West. The 100 Days also included efforts to improve conditions for farmers. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, let the government try to raise farm prices by establishing production quotas for major crops and paying farmers not to plant more. Many crops were destroyed, and most controversially, 6 million pigs were slaughtered. The AAA successfully raised farm prices and incomes, but large farmers benefited the most, and few small farmers, tenant farmers, or agricultural laborers received assistance. AAA policies actually encouraged the eviction of tenants, many of whom took to the roads and migrated to the West Coast. The beginning, in 1930, of unusually dry weather in the Midwest also worsened the Depression's effect on rural America. By the mid-1930s, the most severe drought in the nation's history caused soil that had deteriorated from modern farming methods to simply blow away in the wind, creating the Dust Bowl, as areas in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado were called. The drought and storms displaced more than 1 million farmers, whose massive trek to the Pacific coast was captured in John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath. Another New Deal initiative, the Resettlement Administration, which was founded in 1934, relocated rural and urban families in communities planned by the federal government in areas like Greenbelt, just outside of Washington, D.C. This is a map which was published by the Public Works Administration in 1935 and depicts some of the numerous infrastructure projects funded by the New Deal. Among the most famous public works projects are the Triborough Bridge in New York City, the Overseas Highway in Florida, and the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington. Overall, the New Deal spent $250 billion in today's money to construct, among other things, 40,000 public buildings, 72,000 schools, 80,000 bridges, and 8,000 parks. This is a map showing the reach of the Tennessee Valley Authority, covering all or parts of 7 southeastern states. This is a map of the affected area of the Dust Bowl in 1935 through 1940. This image shows a giant dust storm engulfing a town in western Kansas on April 14, 1935, known as Black Sunday in the American West. This image shows sharecroppers evicted from the farms on which they had been working in New Madrid County, Missouri, as a result of government subsidies to farm owners to reduce crop production. By the late 1920s, homeownership had become a sign of respectability among the middle class and offered security to workers who faced low wages, irregular employment, and limited occupational mobility. But then the Depression destroyed the American housing industry. The building of new homes virtually halted, and banks and savings and loans associations that financed homeownership collapsed or survived by foreclosing on mortgages. President Hoover established a federally sponsored bank to issue home loans, but only with the New Deal did the federal government systematically intervene in the housing market. Roosevelt stated that the security of the home was a fundamental right. In 1933 and 1934, his administration undertook efforts to protect homeowners from foreclosure and stimulate new construction. The Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, insured millions of long-term mortgages issued by private banks. The government also built thousands of units of low-rent housing. Thanks to the FHA and later the Veterans Administration, homeownership became a reality for tens of millions of families. In FDR's first 2 years, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing prohibition. The Federal Communications Commission was established to supervise radio and telephone communications, and the Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate stock and bond markets. The first New Deal was a series of experiments, some of which failed, that transformed the role of the federal government and assisted millions of Americans in the midst of the Depression. But it did not end the Depression. In 1934, 10 million Americans, more than 20% of the labor force, were still out of work. In 1935, the Supreme Court, still dominated by conservative Republican judges who believed in 19th century notions of freedom such as liberty of contract, began to strike down New Deal laws. The NRA was declared unconstitutional because its codes and regulations delegated legislative powers to the president and attempted to regulate local businesses not engaged in interstate commerce. In January 1936, the court killed the AAA, which it declared an unconstitutional use of congressional power over local economic activity. In June 1936, the court ruled that New York could not set a minimum wage for women and children. The artist Bernarda Shawn, wife of the more famous painter Ben Shawn, created this lithograph in the mid-1930s for the Resettlement Administration, a New Deal agency that relocated rural and urban families, especially victims of the Dust Bowl, to planned communities. This chart shows that the Great Depression led to a collapse in the construction industry. This is Russell Lee's 1939 photograph of a migrant family saying grace before eating by the side of the road near Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, and shows how, even in the most difficult circumstances, families struggled to maintain elements of their normal lives. This is The Illegal Act, a cartoon critical of the Supreme Court's decision declaring the NRA unconstitutional. FDR tells a drowning Uncle Sam, "I'm sorry, but the Supreme Court says I must chuck you back in." Perhaps the most dramatic development of the mid-1930s was the organization of millions of workers into unions in the mass production industries that had successfully resisted unionization. Called labor's great upheaval, this unprecedented militancy was unexpected. This time, the federal government seemed to side with workers through the NIRA and the Wagner Act of 1935, which gave workers the legal right to form unions. With the drastic reduction in European immigration, cultural differences between workers were less important. American-born children of the new immigrants now dominated the workforce. Militant socialists and communists with years of experience in organizing provided leadership to this movement. American factories were small tyrannies in which unions were rare. Workers could be assaulted by supervisors and fired at will, and managers determined the length of the workday and the speed of assembly lines. Local governments supported employers. Workers demanded more than just higher wages in the 1930s. They wanted an end to employers' arbitrary rules and basic civil liberties for workers, such as the right to picket, hand out literature, and meet to discuss grievances. All these demands required union recognition. Roosevelt's election inspired those who hoped to end industrial despotism. In 1934, labor revolted. 2,000 strikes broke out, including violent, massive strikes in Toledo, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. Only a huge nationwide strike of textile workers failed to achieve any of its goals. This upheaval challenged the AFL's old model of organizing workers by craft skill, rather than organizing all workers in a particular industry, such as steel, into one union. When the AFL convention in 1935 refused an appeal by 30 AFL leaders for the creation of industrial unions, John L. Lewis, head of the United Mine Workers, forced a split that led to the creation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO. The CIO, Lewis said, would win economic freedom and industrial democracy for American workers. In December 1936, the United Auto Workers, a small CIO union, conducted a sit-down strike, occupying a General Motors plant in Cleveland. Soon, such strikes spread to GM auto factories in Flint, Michigan. Strikers defended the plants from police attacks, and Michigan's governor refused to send troops to break the strike. In February 1937, GM capitulated and recognized the UAW. Ford did not recognize the UAW until 1941. By then, the UAW had hundreds of thousands of members. The triumph in the auto industry spread to the steel industry, which recognized unions by 1938. By 1940, around 9 million workers were in unions, double the number in 1930. Unions won rights to influence management decisions and gained new grievance and seniority procedures. Unlike the AFL, the CIO embraced positive government intervention in labor management affairs. It presented a program for federal economic and social policy, including public housing, universal health care, and unemployment and old age insurance. The CIO built on the increasingly popular idea that prosperity would rise from an American standard of living for all Americans based on mass consumption, and argued that the Depression was caused by the highly unequal distribution of wealth and income. By mid-decade, many New Dealers accepted this under-consumptionist explanation of the Depression, which saw lack of effective consumer demand as its cause. In this image, police break up a gathering along the San Francisco waterfront on the eve of the general strike involving over 200,000 workers in May 1934. This image shows signs carried by striking cotton mill workers in Lumberton, North Carolina, in 1937, and illustrate how the labor movement revived the 19th century language of wage slavery to demand union recognition. This photo shows a sit-down strike at a General Motors factory in Flint, Michigan, in 1937. Other popular movements of the mid-1930s emphasized economic justice. In California, novelist Upton Sinclair won the Democratic nomination for governor in 1934 as head of the End Poverty in California movement, which called for the state to form industrial and farm cooperatives to create jobs. One of the nation's first modern negative campaigns cost him the election. Huey Long of Louisiana, representing the state's populist and socialist traditions and its undemocratic politics, rose to power as governor in 1928 and U.S. Senator in 1930. He used his power to build roads, schools, and hospitals, and heavily taxed oil companies. Called the Kingfish, Long, in 1934, launched the Share Our Wealth movement, which called for confiscating the wealth of the richest Americans in order to finance an immediate grant of $5,000 and a guaranteed job and annual income for all citizens. Long claimed to have 5 million followers. He was about to declare a run for president in 1935 when he was assassinated. Dr. Francis Townsend, a California physician, won support for his plan for the government to make monthly payments of $200 to older Americans, with the requirement that they spend it immediately to boost the economy. By 1934, 2 million people had joined Townsend clubs. Along with the rise of the CIO, these signs of popular discontent helped to spark the Second New Deal. Many religious leaders of various denominations connected to the general public through mass media outlets during the era. Ironically, many fundamentalists used the most modern communications outlets to promote their anti-modernist messages. For example, in the mid-1930s, Father Charles E. Coughlin, the radio priest, attracted millions of listeners each week with broadcasts attacking Wall Street bankers and greedy capitalists. Initially a supporter of FDR, Coughlin soon became increasingly critical of what he saw as a failed New Deal. His crusade later shifted to anti-Semitism and support for European fascism. Other religious leaders took advantage of the mass media to spread their beliefs. It was a method to communicate directly with audiences instead of progressing through established denominations. For example, during the 1920s, Aimee Semple McPherson, a Los Angeles revivalist, had her own radio station, which broadcast her International Church of the Foursquare Gospel Sermons. This is an image of Huey Long, the kingfish of Louisiana politics, in full rhetorical flight. The photo was probably taken in 1934 when Long was in the U.S. Senate, but still running the state government. This is a cover of a songbook to accompany a radio broadcast from the Chicago Gospel Tabernacle. A radio tower dominates the image. These popular movements and the CIO helped create the Second New Deal, which Roosevelt, having been buoyed by Democratic gains in Congress in 1934, launched in 1935. The first New Deal had focused on economic recovery. The second was centered on economic security, the guarantee that government would protect Americans from unemployment and poverty. The belief that a lack of consumer demand had caused the Depression had become popularized by Long, Townsend, and the CIO. By 1935, many New Dealers believed government should no longer try to stimulate business recovery, but rather should redistribute income in order to sustain mass purchasing power in the consumer economy. Congress imposed a tax on large fortunes and corporate profits and created the Rural Electrification Agency, REA, to bring electricity to homes, thus enabling rural Americans to purchase household appliances. The REA brought electricity to millions of homes and was one of the most successful New Deal programs. The federal government also tried to promote soil conservation and family farming, as policymakers believed that prosperity was impossible if farmers' standard of living lagged behind that of urban workers and the middle class. In 1934, FDR had limited federal employment programs, but now he established the Works Progress Administration, WPA, which hired 3 million Americans each year until it ended in 1943. Directed by Harry Hopkins, the WPA transformed the American landscape. It built thousands of public buildings, bridges, roads, airports, stadiums, swimming pools, and sewage treatment plants. The WPA even employed white-collar professionals. The most famous WPA projects were in the arts and included murals, historical and tourist guidebooks, and the federal theater and dance projects. In 1935, Congress also created a National Youth Administration to provide relief to American teenagers and young adults. The Wagner Act was another major Second New Deal measure. It democratized the American workplace by empowering a National Labor Relations Board to supervise elections in which employees voted on union representation. Sponsored by Senator Robert Wagner of New York, the bill also made illegal unfair labor practices, such as firing and blacklisting union organizers that had stymied organization in the past. Collective bargaining was redefined as a crucial element of American freedom, and now that it was legally protected, it offered workers a mechanism by which they could win higher wages and thus contribute to the recovery. This photograph of Wilder, Tennessee in 1942 illustrates the achievements and limits of the New Deal in rural America. The Tennessee Valley Authority has brought electricity to this section of the small town, but the outdoor pump is still residents' sole source of water. This is a poster by the artist Vera Bach for the Federal Art Project of the Works Progress Administration, and it depicts farmers and laborers joining hands to produce prosperity. In 1935, under the auspices of the Works Progress Administration, the New York Jewish Theater Unit put on a production based on Sinclair Lewis's novel, It Can't Happen Here. In the drama, a demagogue who is elected president by promising economic change and a return to traditional values proceeds to establish an authoritarian regime akin to Hitler's Germany. The Social Security Act of 1935 was the most important element of the Second New Deal. It represented Roosevelt's belief that the government had to guarantee the material well-being of ordinary Americans. It established a system of unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and aid to the disabled, the elderly poor, and families with dependent children. Though these programs built on old progressive proposals, this was a permanent system of social insurance. The Social Security Act created the American version of the welfare state, a term with origins in World War II-era Britain that referred to income assistance, medical care, and social services for all citizens. Although unprecedented in American history, the American welfare state, as compared to welfare states in Europe, was more decentralized, spent less, and covered fewer citizens. The original Social Security bill contained a system of national health insurance that was eliminated after vehement opposition by the American Medical Association, which feared the government regulation of doctors' incomes and practices. While some New Dealers wanted a universal program funded by general tax revenues with a single set of eligibility standards administered by federal officials, Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins and powerful members of Congress wanted to keep relief in state and local hands and make workers contribute to the costs of their own benefits. FDR wanted Social Security taxes to come from employers and workers rather than general revenues, in order to give working citizens a legal, moral, and political right to collect their old age pensions and unemployment benefits, which Congress would not dare violate. Thus, Social Security became a mixture of national and local funding, control, and eligibility standards. Old age pensions were administered nationally, but paid for by taxes on workers and employers. These taxes also paid for unemployment insurance, but this was decentralized, allowing states to set unemployment benefit levels. The states paid most of the costs for direct poor relief in a program called Aid to Dependent Children, and eligibility and payment varied greatly. Social Security was a significant departure from American government's traditional function, and the Second New Deal dramatically changed the relationship between the federal government and American citizens. Before the 1930s, Americans asked whether the government should intervene in the economy. After the New Deal, Americans asked only how the government should intervene. This slide shows a 1935 poster promoting the new Social Security system. The Depression ensured that Americans would face, in the words of one writer, a reckoning with liberty. FDR declared that for too many Americans, life was no longer free, liberty no longer real. Men no longer follow the pursuit of happiness. Most Americans assumed that liberty required a new meaning. The New Deal transformed the idea of freedom by tying it to the growing power of the national government. Roosevelt was not just a master politician, but also a brilliant communicator, and with his opponent controlling most of the newspapers, he turned to the radio to reach Americans with weekly broadcasts called fireside chats in order to build support for his policies. FDR adopted old terms and ideas to defend his innovative policies, most notably liberalism, which he redefined as government that was large, active, and socially conscious. In his second fireside chat, Roosevelt contrasted the older notion of liberty as liberty of contract, which served the privileged few, to his definition of the concept as greater security for the average man. He continued to positively associate freedom with economic security and identify economic inequality as its greatest foe. Yet, a concept of liberty defined as freedom from powerful government animated his opponents. They argued that New Deal spending undermined fiscal responsibility and that new regulations suppressed American freedom. Conservative businessmen and politicians formed an organization, the American Liberty League, to oppose his policies. As the 1930s went on, his opponents increasingly employed the language of liberty to paint FDR as a dictator who threatened traditional American freedoms. By 1936, politics reflected class divisions more than at any other point in American history. Working-class voters provided large majorities for the Democratic Party, and large and small businessmen were alienated from the New Deal. Americans divided over their definitions of liberty. One magazine editor said that citizens had two opposing concepts of liberty, one based on free enterprise and the other a socialized liberty based on inequality of wealth and goods. A fight over the ideal of freedom defined the 1936 presidential campaign. The Democrats insisted that in a modern economy, the government is obliged to guarantee a democracy of opportunity for all. Roosevelt, in his speech accepting the nomination, attacked economic royalists who intended to establish a tyranny over ordinary people. He insisted that economic rights were the precondition for liberty and that poor men are not free men. Moreover, he argued that large corporations constituted a new despotism that threatened economic freedom. FDR faced the Republican nominee and former Kansas Governor Alfred Landon, who denounced Social Security and other New Deal programs as a threat to individual liberty. Roosevelt, however, won by a landslide, carrying every state except for Maine and Vermont. Strong support from organized labor and his ability to unite Southern whites and Northern blacks, Protestant farmers and urban Catholic and Jewish ethnics, and industrial workers and middle-class homeowners won him the election. These groups formed the so-called New Deal coalition, which dominated American politics for the next 50 years. This image shows FDR delivering one of his fireside chats. Roosevelt was the first president to make effective use of the radio to promote his policies. This 1935 cartoon by William Gropper portrays Uncle Sam as Gulliver, tied down by Lilliputians in the famous 18th century novel Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. In this case, the bonds are the numerous agencies and laws created by the New Deal, which, Gropper suggests, are inhibiting the country from getting back on its feet during the Great Depression. At his inauguration, FDR admitted that the Depression was not over and promised to do more to help the significant minority of Americans who were still in need of assistance. Encouraged by his massive victory, Roosevelt committed what many believe was an enormous error. Arguing that several Supreme Court justices were too old to perform their functions, he proposed that the president be allowed to appoint a new justice for each who remained on the court past age 70, 6 at that time. FDR's goal was to change the balance of power on a court that might invalidate Social Security, the Wagner Act, and other parts of the Second New Deal. Immediately, however, the president was criticized as an aspiring dictator. Congress rejected the plan, but Roosevelt's court-packing threat seemed to persuade the court to accept economic regulation by the state and federal governments. The court soon upheld a minimum wage law, affirmed federal power to regulate wages, hours, and child labor, and rejected challenges to Social Security and the Wagner Act. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes said that while the term freedom of contract did not appear in the Constitution, liberty did, and it required legal protections against social evils that menaced the people's welfare. The Second New Deal slowed after the court-packing fight. Although the Housing Act, passed in 1937, signaled the first major effort to build homes for the poorest in America, the Fair Labor Standards Bill in 1938, which banned goods produced by child labor, set a minimum wage and required overtime pay for more than 40 hours of work per week, languished in Congress for a year before it passed. This bill established federal regulation of wages and working conditions in a radical departure from pre-Depression policies. In 1937, the economy slumped sharply after FDR, who saw economic improvements in 1936, decreased federal farm and WPA work relief. This caused business investment, production, and stocks to also fall and unemployment to rise. In 1936, in The General Theory of Employment, Interests, and Money, John Maynard Keynes criticized economists' commitment to balanced budgets. He argued that massive government spending was needed, even at the cost of deficits, to sustain purchasing power and stimulate economic activity during downturns. By 1938, Roosevelt had adopted this solution, which became known as Keynesian economics, and he asked Congress for billions for more work relief and farm aid. The New Deal had shifted from economic planning to economic redistribution, and then to public spending. The Second New Deal was over. This is Fall In, a cartoon commenting on Roosevelt's proposal to pack the Supreme Court, from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, January 8th of 1937. The New Deal did not really solve the problem of unemployment, which fell below 10% only in 1941, as the United States prepared to enter World War II. Roosevelt conceived of the Second New Deal's assistance to broad groups of needy Americans, the unemployed, elderly, and dependent, as a right of citizenship, not a special privilege. But the realities of inherited ideas about gender and Black disenfranchisement in the South powerfully affected legislation. The New Deal affected different groups of Americans in very different ways. The New Deal incorporated women into government more than any other previous administration. A number of talented women, such as Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, advised the president and affected policy. The best known of these was Eleanor Roosevelt, who became the first modern First Lady, using her position for the reform in civil rights, labor laws, and work relief. But organized feminism was absent in the 1930s. The Depression actually provoked calls for women to leave the labor market in order to open up jobs for unemployed men. The federal government enacted laws that led to the dismissal of female government employees, and many private employers denied jobs to married women. Even the CIO, which organized female workers, adhered to the notion that women should be supported by men. The ideal of the male-headed household powerfully shaped social policy, because paying taxes on wages made one eligible for the most generous Social Security programs, old age pensions, and unemployment insurance. They did not cover most women because most women did not work outside the home. The program excluded the 3 million mostly female domestic workers. This is an image of Eleanor Roosevelt. She transformed the role of First Lady by taking an active and visible part in public life. Here she visits a West Virginia coal mine in 1933. This photograph from 1933 depicts a march in New York City organized by the Association of Unemployed Single Women. Many men believed that public works jobs and governmental relief should not go to women, who, the logic went, could be supported by their husbands or fathers. Although Roosevelt strove to portray the federal government as representing all people in America, the power of the Solid South molded the New Deal welfare state into an entitlement of white Americans. With Black disenfranchisement, Democrats controlled the South. Southern Democratic members of Congress were elected again and again by tiny white electorates. Because committee chairmanships rested on seniority, once the Democrats took control of Congress in 1933, Southerners took the key leadership positions. Roosevelt believed he could not challenge the Southern Democrats if he wanted New Deal laws to be passed. Southern Democrats denied Social Security to agricultural and domestic workers, which were the largest categories of Black employment. Only Black organizations and the left pushed for truly universal social insurance. In 1935, Congressman Ernest Lundeen of Minnesota had introduced a bill to create a federal system of old age, unemployment, and health benefits for all wage workers and support for female heads of households with dependents, but it was replaced by the Social Security bill. Because of this Southern veto, most Black workers were limited to the least generous and most vulnerable parts of the new welfare state. Direct public assistance programs were ostensibly open to all poor seniors and families with dependent children who demonstrated financial need. But benefits were set low, and eligibility was determined by state and local officials who had broad authority. In the South, this translated into widespread discrimination. Because recipients of direct assistance did not pay Social Security taxes, they soon bore a stigma of dependency on government handouts, which became known simply as welfare. The stigma intensified until pressure for reform led the federal government to abolish its responsibility for welfare in 1996, during the administration of Bill Clinton. This image shows students from Howard University outside the National Crime Conference in Washington, D.C. in 1934. They wore nooses and the names of victims to protest the conference's failure to include the subject of lynching in its program. This is a 1936 photograph and shows a Black farmer with his son repaying a loan from the Farm Security Administration, which sought to improve the conditions of poor landowning farmers and sharecroppers. The client wears what is probably his nicest attire to meet with the government official. The Depression and the New Deal had contradictory impacts on the nation's racial minorities. Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Collier launched an Indian New Deal, ending the policy of coerced assimilation and granting unprecedented cultural autonomy. He replaced boarding schools with reservation schools and increased spending on Indian health. He also ended the policy, which had been implemented since passage of the Dawes Act, of dividing Indian lands into small plots for individual families and selling off the rest. Federal officials now recognize the rights of Indians to govern their own communities, except in areas covered by federal law. Though the New Deal was the most radical shift in Indian policy in American history, it barely improved living conditions on extremely poor reservations. The Depression devastated Mexican Americans, 400,000 of whom returned to Mexico when the demand for their labor declined. Some were coerced into moving by authorities in the Southwest. Perhaps 200,000 Mexican American children who were born in the United States and were thus citizens were also pressured to move to Mexico. Those who stayed mostly worked in desperate conditions on large corporate farms in the Southwest. The Wagner and Social Security Acts did not apply to agricultural workers, and when these workers tried to unionize, they were brutally suppressed. Mexican American leaders tried to develop a strategy to claim rights as white Americans, but they also sought support from the Mexican government and promoted a mystical sense of pride and identification with Mexican heritage, which was later given the name La Raza. Mexican Americans were not the only group that was encouraged to leave the United States. In 1935, Congress passed the Filipino Repatriation Act, offering free transportation to people born in the Philippines who were willing to return. People who did leave would only be able to return by applying under the Philippines' annual immigration quota of 50. Given the lack of economic opportunity in the Philippines and fear about being permanently unable to return to the United States, only around 2,000 accepted this offer. The Farm Security Administration hired noted photographers to document American life. This image, by Dorothea Lange from 1938, shows Hispanic women packing apricots in Brentwood, California. This image shows a large crowd of Mexican Americans waiting to leave a Los Angeles train station in 1932 as part of the repatriation campaign. Always last hired and first fired, African Americans suffered the most in the Depression. Blacks who kept their jobs now competed with unemployed whites. Facing an unemployment rate twice that of whites, blacks benefited less from direct government relief and public works projects. The Depression forced blacks to make economic survival their primary demand. Even W.E.B. Du Bois surrendered his hopes for racial integration and instead urged blacks to think of themselves as a nation within a nation. He urged blacks to build an independent, cooperative economy within their own communities and take control of separate schools. While Roosevelt seemed little interested in race relations or civil rights, he appointed Mary McLeod Bethune, a well-known black educator, as his advisor on minority affairs, and appointed blacks to other positions as well. Key members of his administration, including his wife and Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, criticized segregation, disenfranchisement, and lynching. Blacks generally supported the New Deal and started voting for the Democratic Party, shifting away from their traditional support for Republicans. Their hopes for broader changes were stymied by the influence of white Southern Democrats in the party. Federal housing policy powerfully reinforced residential segregation and showed the limitations of New Deal freedom. Local officials implemented national housing policy in ways that reinforced existing racial discrimination. Nearly all municipalities, in both the North and the South, insisted that housing sponsored by the federal government must be racially segregated. The Federal Housing Administration also ensured mortgages that contained clauses barring future sale to non-whites. Federal employment practices also engaged in racial discrimination. In the federal government, few blacks held skilled or professional positions, and in the South, many New Deal construction projects refused to hire blacks. The New Deal's modernization of Southern agriculture led large landowners to displace tenant farmers, many of whom were blacks, from their lands. Only with the Great Society programs of the 1960s was the welfare state extended in ways to fully incorporate Black Americans. This is an image of future Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., at the center with a billboard, taking part in a Don't Buy Where You Can't Work demonstration in Harlem during the Depression. The campaign targeted stores that served Black customers but refused to hire Black employees. The photograph is copyrighted by Morgan and Marvin Smith. This is a map of Philadelphia prepared by the Homeowners Loan Corporation and illustrates how federal agencies engaged in redlining of neighborhoods containing blue-collar and Black residents. The result was to strongly reinforce housing segregation. The colors correspond to the agency's perception of an area's real estate prospects. Wealthy neighborhoods, colored green and given the best credit ratings, were expected to be racially and ethnically homogeneous. White-collar districts in blue were second best. Red districts, the worst, had an undesirable population. The corporation prepared maps like this for many cities and shared them with private lenders and the Federal Housing Administration, resulting in massive disinvestment in red districts. During the 1930s, the South remained rigidly segregated. This 1939 photograph by Dorothea Lange depicts a colored movie theater in the Mississippi Delta. If the New Deal did not end second-class citizenship for Blacks, the 1930s saw the inclusion of other groups into mainstream American life. With Catholics and Jews in prominent posts in Roosevelt's administration and new immigrant voters forming a base of the Democratic Party, the New Deal made ethnic pluralism central to American politics. The election of Fiorello LaGuardia, an Italian-American, as New York's mayor in 1933, represented the growing power of ethnic working-class voters. These ethnic groups experienced growing cultural assimilation, as immigration from Europe virtually halted and movies, chain stores, and mass advertising penetrated immigrant enclaves. Unlike the coercive Americanization of the past, however, this Americanization incorporated ethnic identity and married it to American political ideals. In the mid-1930s, for the first time in U.S. history, the left, including socialists, communists, labor radicals, and many New Deal liberals, strongly influenced American politics and culture. The CIO, and the Communist Party in particular, became the center of a social and intellectual impulse that helped reshape the boundaries of American freedom. The Communist Party grew from a very small and isolated group into a mass organization. Although it never had more than 100,000 members at any one time in the 1930s, several times that number passed through its ranks. The Communists' dedication to socialism appealed to a widespread belief that the Depression showed capitalism had failed. But more important was the party's constant activity on behalf of the unemployed, workers and unions, and civil rights for African Americans. At the height of the Popular Front, when the Communists sought to ally themselves with socialist and New Deal liberals in movements for reform rather than revolution, the Communist Party was considered respectable. Ironically, even though it was tied to Stalinist Russia, the Communist Party contributed to expansion of freedom via New Deal liberalism and its pluralist conception of America. The Popular Front vision of American society greatly influenced American culture through theater, film, and dance. Its broadly left-wing ethos defined social and economic radicalism, and not support for status quo as true Americanism. Ethnic and racial diversity, unionism, and social citizenship were what made America great, not the pursuit of wealth. The American people, who were seen by many intellectuals in the 1920s as fundamentalist and crassly commercial, were now proclaimed embodiments of democratic virtue. Artists and writers in the 1930s crafted socially meaningful work that depicted daily life for ordinary farmers and urban workers. And artworks about migrant workers and sharecroppers and those that were created by the people, such as folk music and Black spirituals, were held to express genuine Americanism. The Democratic Party, despite its new Northern Black and ethnic base of support, did not embrace ethnocultural issues. But the Popular Front insisted that the nation's greatness lay in its diversity, tolerance, and rejection of ethnic prejudice and class privilege. The CIO promoted and often embodied this idea of ethnic and racial inclusivity. It adopted cultural pluralism and welcomed groups previously had been excluded from the labor movement, such as Blacks and Mexican Americans. Yet, while Popular Front culture celebrated the promise of America, it did not ignore its tragedies and troubles, such as racial discrimination. This idea is best encapsulated in Martha Graham's 1938 modern dance masterpiece, American Document. This is a card issued by the Communist Party during the 1936 campaign and illustrates the party's attempt at Americanization. Note the images of the American Revolution and Abraham Lincoln, as well as its emphasis on interracialism. James Ford, an African American, was the party's vice presidential candidate. History of Southern Illinois, a mural sponsored by the Illinois Federal Art Project, illustrates the widespread fascination during the 1930s with American traditions and the lives of ordinary Americans. On the left, a man strums a guitar while workers labor on the waterfront. This is a scene from the Emancipation episode of Martha Graham's American Document, photographed by Barbara Morgan. The dancers are Martha Graham and Eric Hawkins. Popular Front culture strongly condemned racism as incompatible with Americanism, compared to New Deal liberalism's tepid stance on issues of race and civil rights. While Jewish and Catholic groups promoted ethnic and religious tolerance, the Communist Party was the only mostly white organization of the era to prioritize combating racism. The Communists even found support in the conservative South. Communist groups mobilized popular support for Black defendants victimized by a racist criminal justice system, which made the Scottsboro case an international cause. 9 young Black men in Scottsboro, Alabama, were arrested in 1931 for raping 2 white women. Although one of the 2 accusers recanted, the men were put on trial and convicted 3 times. The Supreme Court rejected the first 2 verdicts and created legal principles that greatly expanded civil liberties, that defendants have a constitutional right to effective legal representation, and that Blacks cannot be systematically excluded from juries. But the court approved the 3rd conviction, and 5 of the men went to prison for more than a decade. White workers' resistance did not keep the CIO from welcoming Black members and supporting anti-lynching laws and voting rights for Southern Blacks. For the first time, the CIO brought large numbers of Blacks into the labor movement, even after the exclusion had made them hostile to unions for many years. Popular Front culture also supported civil liberties, especially the right of workers to organize unions. Pro-union workers forced local laws restricting free speech and repression by private and public police. Public concern about violence directed at Southern tenant farmers and Northern industrial workers made discussions of labor rights discussions over civil liberties. In 1936, a Senate committee led by Robert M. La Follette exposed the harsh methods employers used to fight unionization, including spies and private police. Critics argued that America's workplaces resembled European dictatorships. Workers' militancy also showcased that the free speech of groups, and not just individuals, could also be violated. And the federal government responded by emphasizing the importance of civil liberties. The Supreme Court abandoned liberty of contract for a definition of American freedom based on civil liberties and allowed free speech for communists, labor picketing, and initiated the repeal of numerous state laws that inhibited expression. Yet other groups also tried to restrict free speech. In 1938, the U.S. House of Representatives created an Un-American Activities Committee to ferret out disloyalty and un-American behavior in speech. And 2 years later, Congress passed the Smith Act, which made it a crime to teach, advocate, or encourage the overthrow of government. Similar committees were established at the state level and used to intimidate communists and others on the left. This image shows the Scottsboro Boys, flanked by 2 prison guards with their lawyer, Samuel Leibovitz. This 1935 May Day parade in New York City includes a placard celebrating the Bill of Rights. By 1940, the New Deal was ending. Growing numbers of Southern Democrats opposed Roosevelt's policies. Roosevelt exposed the poverty and lack of economic development in the South, and a new generation of homegrown Southern radicals, Southern New Dealers, black activists, labor leaders, communists, and a few elected officials, began organizing for unions, unemployment relief, and racial justice. Instead of simply shaping New Deal measures to accommodate their racial and economic preferences, Southern Democrats, who feared that federal intervention in the region would lead to more unions and racial conflict, started to oppose Roosevelt's proposals altogether. In response, in 1938, FDR appealed to Southern voters to support more progressive, pro-New Deal Southern Democratic candidates in the congressional elections. Instead, however, the South's small electorate resisted and re-elected the incumbents. In the North, court-packing and the rise of the CIO led middle-class voters to go toward the Republicans. The Republicans gained a significant number of seats, and a stalemate in Congress followed. Congress started to eliminate many popular New Deal programs, and Roosevelt turned his administration's attention toward Europe and impending war. The New Deal seems limited, given the enormous catastrophe it confronted. Compared to European welfare states, Social Security was confined to fewer functions and not as well funded. The New Deal had not improved race or gender relations, and had actually worsened them in many ways. But nonetheless, it accomplished many things, most importantly, making the federal government an active force in regulating and shaping economic life. It also restored Americans' faith in democracy, reconfigured American party and electoral politics, and reinvigorated ideas of freedom to include a more diverse American people. However, even the New Deal could not undo the Depression, which was finally ended only by the mass employment created by World War II.